Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. I'm very excited for this one, and this one particularly. So, to celebrate our launch of Lucidea's Grant Directory and Workbook, which you can also find on our website by going to lucidea.com/grants-directory, we have teamed up with Rachel and created this webinar called Ask Me Anything About Grants. So you were able to submit up to three of most of your pressing grant questions during the registration process on the following topics around number one, grant search strategies. Number two, determining what grants are the best fits for you. And lastly, the grant project ideas. So Rachel has finally compiled your questions together and will be sharing her answers with you. And this is really a great opportunity to get direction on applying for your grants from Rachel, and she's the author of the Survivor's Guide to Museum Grant Writing from Lucidea Press. So my name is Emmanuel. I'll be moderating today's webinar. And with me today, obviously, is none other than Rachael Cristine Woody, who will be answering your questions that you submitted earlier. But before we begin, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items. First, to make sure we get as much value from this webinar, the webinar will be muted so that we can take advantage of the questions that you actually submitted earlier, and Rachel can provide a more insightful answers. Second, we encourage you to go to the question and answer, or we encourage you to actually also participate, and there is a widget there. If you have any follow-up questions, feel free to address that in the widget as well, because there might be some follow-up questions that we could also possibly address later on, and we'll talk about that as well. And lastly, for those of you who may want to revisit this webinar, we always record webinars for your benefit as well. But so in order for you to go to these recordings, just go to our website, lucidea.com. So with that out of the way, I would like to talk to you a little bit about our company. So at Lucidea, we work with museums, archives, and libraries and other informational professionals to provide better access to their collections. So we focus on bringing you the best solutions from around the world, but we are comprised of series of products and companies that have joined Lucidea over the last 30 years. So these brands you may have heard of already are Argus, Sydney, Imagic, Archivera, Eloquent, and Quadrastar. So that is a little bit about our company. Well, we are here today, obviously, to listen to Rachel, and I would like to share a little bit about her background. So Rachel actually provides consulting services to museums, libraries, and archives. She specializes in grant acquisition for museums, history, and heritage organizations. She's also the one thing to highlight. She is the creator of Going from Zero to Winning with Grants and Growing Grant Success with Better Grant Writing Workshops. And that tours nationally and will be soon available also on her online courses. Previously, Rachel was at the Freer Sackler Museum of the Smithsonian Institution and the Oregon Wine History Archives at Linfield College. Within both organizations, she launched multiple special projects due to her repeated success in grant writing. So without further ado, I would like to pass it to Rachel, and she will be actually sharing her answers with the questions that you actually submitted earlier. Rachel?
Okay, thank you so much, Emmanuel, for introducing me and to Lucidea for hosting us today. And thank you to everybody who's attending and who sent questions ahead of time. In fact, we got such a great response. Lucidea and I were very pleased to see how many questions came in. And in fact, there were so many questions that we are actually going to break this Ask Me Anything webinar into a little miniature series. So with the questions that we got, which were over 60, I think we hit 75 officially. I'll answer about half of those today, and took a good spread across the three different categories. And then we're going to have a part 2 where I'll answer the second set of questions. But since we have this opportunity to answer more questions, As we go through this today, I encourage you to think of any sort of follow-up questions you may have, or any questions you forgot to ask. Write those down and submit them and register for the next part 2 webinar, and there will be more info for that at the end of this presentation. But just wanted to plant that seed because there is going to be more sessions like this. So write those questions down and we will get to them. All right. So just a quick disclaimer, I do want to acknowledge that everybody has their own individual organization. So, organization type, library, archive, museum, different budget needs, different collections, different situations, etc. And so just know that the answers I'm providing, I don't have your specific scenario and all the details available to me. So what I'm going to attempt to do is just provide you answers that are based on best practices and strategies that I use based on the experiences that I've had and that I've seen most commonly when I do grant writing and grant reviews. So while I can't give you a very specific or detailed answer just for your situation, I know that many of these answers you'll be able to take them back to your shop and apply them to whatever your particular situation is. So Emmanuel introduced the 3 categories that our questions are grouped in, and just a quick refresher. The first one we're going to focus on is grant search strategies, which is perhaps the number one type of question that I get when it comes to grant writing. Then the second bucket of questions are the ones that are related to best fit. So how do we, when we're looking at grant opportunities, know whether or not they're a good grant for us to apply to, which is a question I wish I got asked almost as much as the first one, because fit is very important. And then the third bucket that we're going to look into are questions that are around grant project ideas. So you have to find a grant, you have to make sure it's a good fit, but you also need to make sure that you have good grant project ideas that are competitive enough for you to win those grants. All right, category number 1, what are your questions related to the grant search strategy? So our first question, which starts us off very nicely, is a great grants 101 type question. What are the different types of grants? And there are several different types. The first one is municipal, and that means any sort of government type funding. It could be city grant funding, state or federal grant funding. Another category of grant type is private. So typically foundations are the word that we hear most often in terms of private granting agencies. This could also be the donors or a consortium of donors or the private foundation side of a company. So you can find them in a couple different orientations, but we typically refer to them as foundations. The third, and perhaps one of the most prolific that we see, is nonprofit based. And so those can be local to your area, regional, or national. And then the last one is corporate, and corporate can do it in a number of different ways, whether it's a foundation arm, like we talked about in the second bullet point, or whether it's a company that just does part of the work that they do. Maybe they're a B Corp, etc. There are a couple of different ways they can set up doing corporation giving or corporate matching, that kind of thing. All right, so these next couple are the best places to find grants. First question, where is the best place to find grants? And so there are so many, as you can imagine. Some of the big ones are grants.gov, National Council of Nonprofits, professional organizations, whether your archives, museum, etc. They usually have lists. And then, of course, Lucidea's grants directory portal this is why we're here today. We're helping to celebrate the launch. That has a great directory of both private and municipal at the national level grants. And then it's a little trickier at the local level because of, North America, Canada, and the US. It's a big geographic space, which means that there are a lot of local and regional, state, and province grants. And so I encourage you to take a look at the State Historic Preservation Office if you're in the US. You'll often hear it referred to SHPO, SHPO for the acronym. Also take a look at the nonprofit association of whatever your state is. Going back up to that national level, the National Council of Nonprofits, each state in the United States has its own state local office that tracks all of the local grants for your state. And then any sort of regional associations, county, state level, etc., they will tend to have their own pages that you can do a Google search for, or visit your nonprofit association pages to see those gathered there. So for every location, it is different. So it's hard for me to give you a go exactly here type answer, but hopefully this is enough to give you ideas of where you can look to where this information should be placed. Next question, what is the best search engine to use? And for the most part, any search engine, especially whichever search engine you're comfortable using, search engines, if you're not quite sure what we're talking about, it's things like Google, Bing, I forget what the Safari search is, but you see that search box on the internet and you type in a search phrase and it leads you there. That is a search engine. And it will depend when you're doing your search on the quality of this SEO content, which is search engine optimization. It'll depend on the quality of content from the granting agencies as well as the quality of your search. And I recommend when you do these types of searches to include organization type, like museum grants, project type, museum grants, digitizing, and other keywords that you think are relevant to the type of grant that you're looking for. So continuing the theme of best places to find grants, the next question is there a best database for grants? And so, of course, I'm a little biased here because we are celebrating the launch of the new grants directory, which is a partnership that Lucidea and I have done together. And regional, state, province-wide grants, we don't have those in yet, but we are hoping to add those in as like a next phase. So stay tuned for that. And then the next question, which sort of broadens this, is are there grant aggregator websites that are paid ones, and are they worth it? So there are aggregators out there, and they're commonly, they tend to be more general. So thinking about Candid, which if you're not familiar or if it's been a while since you've done grants, Candid is the new brand for two different grant databases. They used to be Foundation Center and GuideStar. And so they have been smushed together and are now under Candid, and that is a grant aggregator, but it's a whole general list of nonprofits versus the Lucidea grant database. That's just going to be libraries, archives, museums. It's a bit more specialized and therefore more appropriate for you. Other very general nonprofit aggregator type grants are the federal level. You've got grants.gov, of course, and then websites like Grant Watch, Grantscape, Grant Station, Grant Forward, Grant Select, Pivot, RP, and Instrumental with the L at the end. Those are all aggregators. They have grants that you can view for free, but they also have paid subscriptions, which gets into that next question of, is it worth it to pay for it? And it really, it depends. From my point of view, and especially if you are in a specialized organization, which many of you are, those sort of grant databases aren't going to be specialized enough for your organization or project type to be worth having a paid subscription. Also, keep in mind that all of the public libraries will have a subscription to one or more of these that you, with a public library card, can go and use. And also, if you're tied to any academic institution like a university or college, they also tend to have subscriptions to these or other databases. So I recommend checking your free resources first for those types of subscriptions. And then also just keep in mind that because we are so specialized with the work that we do, looking at those more general type grant aggregators usually aren't worth it. Now getting into private donors and foundations. So as we covered in the very first question, what types of grants are there? The municipal, foundation, nonprofit, etc. This is one of those categories. So it can be private donors who are giving money, but also foundations. First question for this category: how do you find private donors and who provide grants or funding? And Candid is probably the best one of the aggregators that we talked about, because it doesn't just have grants. Remember, they smushed together the Foundation Center with GuideStar or GrantStar or whatever it was. The Foundation Center piece of Candid now has all of those foundations that you can search. And so that can be helpful to take a look at. And remember, again, that there's the free version. There's also the one that you can check out at the library. I'm also thinking of the more local level, because for many of us, it makes much more sense to focus on is available to us more locally. And so looking at the local library, there are usually more localized foundation lists available. And also checking in with your peers, especially if you're a little bit newer to your geographic area or you're new to the donor and foundation scene for your type of organization. Check in with your peers, both at your organization and nearby, to see what sort of network is out there, what they use, where they recommend you look, just so you save some time on like that trial and error and find things that are more appropriate for you faster. And a follow-up question to that is, how do you start a connection/relationship with foundations who don't accept unsolicited proposals? So that is something to keep in mind, is that especially for the bigger prestigious foundations, thinking about like Mellon Foundation, for example, they don't typically allow people to apply for their grants or awards unless they have invited you, is usually the terminology. But then, of course, if you're not already in that sort of pre-accepted network, how do you ever get into it? Which foundations is something that I, as a consultant, find frustrating, because they're not very transparent about what that is and what that looks like. However, what I am seeing now is that more and more often with those more private foundations is that occasionally they will do like open calls. So if they have a new award opportunity that they are announcing and they want to meet and perhaps work with different different organizations, they'll do an open call that is open to everyone to sort of apply. Usually it's a cover letter first. Another thing to think about is any sort of networking opportunities. So even though they are more private foundations, they do tend to show up to panels and nonprofit events, any sort of networking event where you could introduce yourself and get to know them more. And then another thing to think about is doing some research and figuring out who are the staff at those foundations and reaching out to see if you can do like an informational interview, asking questions. While they may not accept unsolicited proposals, it's always worth reaching out, introducing yourself, especially if you think you would be a good fit or if you have a project that might be very attractive to them. I will say, especially now, given a lot of the repair work that we're trying to do at our institutions to be more inclusive and tell more diverse stories, foundations are also having a similar reckoning in terms of realizing that they have funded the same types of organizations over and over again, and now realize that they need to be better partners in the work that we're doing and help fund more diverse work. So it is always worth reaching out and asking the question, is like the thesis of that. And I encourage you to use these different, more informal ways of doing that to see if you can get your foot in the door. Okay, moving on to search strategies to find the best grants. Question: what are the best grant search strategies? So I have a couple tips here. First, become familiar with the grant options out there, especially at your local level. If you are just starting out, the local level is a good place for you to start, building your grant muscles, so to speak. So definitely figuring out like, where are those directories, asking your peers, like thinking about some of the answers that we just covered, getting to know your local area and what those opportunities are. Tip number 2, sign up for the granting agencies and foundation newsletters and or set Google Alerts or something similar. What I like to do, especially because I try and pay attention to a lot of different grant opportunities for the variety of clients that I have, many of those granting agencies have like email newsletter signups, which I know is not our favorite thing typically. However, many of these agencies will only send out an email when they are announcing a new grant opening or new application call. And so it's a great way for me not to have to constantly go check their website, but instead have them notify me when the application is open. So I definitely recommend you do that to sort of save yourself some sanity. And then tip number 3, pay attention to where your peers are getting their money. There's a couple reasons for this, but the main one that I think is the most important for you to realize is that for the peer organizations, either in your area or not near you geographically, but are very similar collections and goals, if they are getting money to do their projects, then the chances are that your organization and your project are also eligible and attractive to whoever that granting agency is that gave money to your peer museum. So it's always a good idea to pay attention to like who's getting what money, because they can't keep getting that money year after year. And so it's not even like a direct competition thing all the time, because you can't get that money every year. And so it's definitely worth paying attention to that and taking advantage of those opportunities. Related, how can I search most efficiently? And I love this question because we all have finite time and resources. So, how can we be the most effective? And I recommend outlining all of like the basic requirements that will determine whether or not it's a good fit for you. And we'll get into suitability and eligibility in a minute. So, bookmark that. But I want you to pay attention to what the organization types are that they fund. Like, is it libraries only, or is it libraries, museums, and archives? What sort of project types are being funded, and what's the project that you're trying to have funded? For example, if you're doing a digitization project, you know you need to have a grant where they fund digitization projects, and it's not worth looking at any other types of grant funded projects. Another important thing to pay attention to is if you've started to create your project and you have a budget in mind, you need to find a grant award that is enough for your project, because if it's too little or too much, then your grant project isn't appropriate for that opportunity. Other things that to pay attention to are award date. Is it too far out? Is it too soon? Goldilocks, try and find the sweet spot in there. And also to pay attention to project duration. Like if your project is one of the larger ones that needs 2 years and you're looking at a grant opportunity that only funds 1 year, then that's probably not a good fit. And then, of course, any other sort of matching requirements. So, like if it requires a 1-for-1 cash match and you don't have that cash to match, then that's probably not a good fit for you. So, all of those items that I mentioned, those are deal breaker items. So, whether you have it or don't have it, and whether the grant opportunity requires that, those like are the top 5 things that you would need to vet and determine in order to even look further. So definitely like have that checklist of those items next to you when you go through those opportunities, and that will help you basically call out what's appropriate or not. Okay, moving on to those who are new to applying for grants. We got some great like foundational questions that I love going over. So the first one, is there a logical progression of grants for a new 501c3 and that is in like the first 1 to 5 years? So like sort of in the baby stage of being a nonprofit. And so the answer for this one is the most successful organizations are the ones who are steadily building on their grant success. So if you are new to grants, and especially if you're a newer organization, you basically need to build your track record. And so starting out with a local modest grant and then moving and building on getting like a medium size, maybe it's a regional grant, And then after successfully doing those two, then going and applying for like a larger and national grant. So as you are building your track record, you're building it from local to national, and you're also building it from like smaller award to really large awards. So this is not like a hard and fast, you have to do it this way, but this is certainly the most methodical way to do it. And it's where I have seen clients be the most successful in doing that steady progression. So that's what I recommend, whether you're a new nonprofit or not. If you are new to grants, then this is how I recommend you do it. Next question, what type of organization documentation, so budgets, financials, policy procedures, etc., are usually needed for success? And the ones that I always see required, so definitely no matter what grant you're applying for, make sure you have these ready and in a file ready to go. If you are the nonprofit, then you need that IRS 501c3 letter saying that you are a nonprofit. You will also need your previous fiscal year's profit and loss statements. And if there is a huge profit and or a huge loss, be prepared to talk about why that is. It's an interesting question that I'm seeing asked often enough in order to help like explain that discrepancy. Then, of course, DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion statements. And not only am I seeing a requirement for statements now, you may also be asked how this project helps support your organization's DEI mission. So be prepared for that. And then, of course, you're going to need your project budget, staff resumes for those people working on the project, consultant or contractor bids, letters of support. So more project specific, what sort of pieces of evidence or what sort of documentation do you need that will help demonstrate your need for that project? Application strategies. Question, how do I determine an appropriate size ask to improve chances of receiving funds? And we use ask in quotation marks here, which is usually whether we're making an ask of a donor, which is a certain money amount, or if we're making an ask of a granting agency, which again is a certain dollar amount. That's how we're using that here. And so I recommend taking a look at the award range and the award history for whatever grant it is that you are looking at. Any of the national grants at the government levels, this is part of the transparency model. They will actually publish the award range as well as past history of their awards, which gives us a great sense of, okay, their award range goes from like 25 to 50,000. However, their award history, I'm seeing like an average of 40,000. Like it's rare to see the maximum of the 50,000. So I know then as the grant writer that even though the max is 50,000, if I get like 40 or under, I will most likely get full funding, is something that you could infer from that information. So do the math and then also pay attention to any of the match requirements that might be there. Some grants require a match, some don't. Some have like a weird hybrid approach. There's a question later on where we get into that. But just pay attention to that. And then if you do have any other funds that are being contributed to this project, whether you already have them in hand or they're promised as sort of like a motivational or leveraged for if you bring in other funds, anything like that is attractive to granting agencies and foundations. So even if they don't require a match, do put that in there if you have it, because that makes it more attractive. Next question, what are strategies for framing proposals for critical work not funded internally and not a current external funding trend? Which this is a common thing, especially for archives, especially versus museums or libraries. Archives are, and forgive me for saying this, but they're not viewed as glamorous as something like museums, which I don't think I'm sharing anything earth-shattering here. I know many of my archivist colleagues feel this frustration. And so the question is, how do you get projects like that? How do you get it funded? Especially if it's not currently a funding trend. And believe it or not, there are trends in funding in terms of like 1 year everybody is doing one type of project and gets funding for it, and then the next year you couldn't get funding no matter how hard you try. So my recommendation, no matter what type of project it is, if it's critical work for you, but it's not viewed as like an exciting or glamorous or current trend, put it within the context of something larger. So, for example, if I need storage to like better storage to put all of my archive or museum objects in, but then I can frame that within a larger goal of the better I can store my objects, then I can move on to the next part, which is digitization, and then move on to the next part of like bringing in different collections because we have better storage, that kind of thing. Framing it storage, which is perhaps boring if you look at it, framing it within that larger, then we can bring more stuff in, then we can digitize, etc. All of a sudden it gets more exciting, right? And funders realize well, you have to do step 1 before you can get to the exciting step 3. So put in that excitement, even if it's not immediate excitement. Another thing to look for, 2 different things, is approaching donors for that type of thing. Especially if they are donors who really are into like the behind the scenes kind of workings. Usually you can get them excited about that. And then also take a look for capacity grants, which are available whether you're a library, archive, or museum. There are capacity grants to help you do that, not as exciting or not a current trend type projects. Continuing with application strategies, how do I find grant funding for the less outward-facing, non-sexy aspects of museum operations? Example, archives, conservation. So building on what we just talked about, and I love whoever framed this as like a sexy, non-sexy thing. So continuing on, seek out funders that are all in on archives or all in on conservation. When Lucidea and I put the grants directory together, we added in tags based on the vetting that I did of the opportunities. And so if you can do faceted searching in the directory that we put together, and you can check I need all of the archive type grants and only the archive type grants. Having those specific granting opportunities for your very specific, even if it's non-sexy need, if you're working with a grant funder where that is all they fund is archives, then of course they are going to find your archives project exciting. And it doesn't matter if anybody else finds it sexy or not. So choosing the right funder is key there. And then I think another thing to think about is, again, thinking about that long-term context, thinking about the bigger picture. When we're looking at especially things like archives, it's all about access, right? As much as we do to help take care of, cultivate, manage collections, ultimately, the number one thing we're looking at is trying to provide access. And so if we are framing the project, even if it's like rehousing, inventory, cataloging, etc., as things that are perhaps viewed as unsexy, it is ultimately toward providing collection access to the world, right? And that part is sexy as viewed by the funders. So framing it using the correct filter, if you will help. Next question. My museum has a large operational budget. How do I convince foundations that we need funding for projects? So when you're operating at that level money-wise, what you provide when you ask someone for money and what you provide for that, there needs to be a bigger and better sort of return on investment, if you will. And you also need to combine that with a view of, look, yes, we do have this X amount of money, but this is all the places where it's going. So demonstrating that that money is going somewhere, it's not just sitting there. It is not available for you to use for the project. And then combining that with a compelling project that they can't refuse. So usually, and especially if you have a lot of money in the context of whatever organization type you are, whatever project you are proposing to those donors or foundation, etc., needs to benefit more than just you. Otherwise, it'll be hard for them to swallow because you do have that much money, whether you really do or not, based on operations, etc. So keep those things in mind. The more money you have, the more you need to do charitably with your neighbors, the more collaborators you need, the more benefits you need to give as a result, that type of thing, to demonstrate that you are a good partner and a good custodian of that money, benefiting more than just yourself. Okay, we are now to the second category of questions. What is your question related to determining what grants are the best fit for you? So now we're going to take a moment to talk about eligibility and suitability. And this is all about how to judge whether a grant opportunity or a foundation opportunity is a good fit for you. So there, in the second bullet, there's some resources where you can go check out. I've done a couple blog posts that have some great checklists for you to go through. But essentially, when we're talking about eligibility, those are like the hard and fast, like you're either eligible or you're not. And those types of things are, the grant is only available for 501c3s, for example. So if you're a 501c3, great, you are eligible. If you're a local county government, no, you are not. So like hard and fast, eligible or not eligible. Suitability is a little bit more gray area, less hard and fast, and it gets more to usually project type and award range and project duration. And so if you are in archives and you want to do a digitization project, you are eligible, your organization, great, check. However, you're not suitable for that grant opportunity because they don't want to fund digitization projects. So while you are eligible for that grant, it is not suitable based on the project that you want to do. So go check out the checklists for some more details on that, but that's a great question to ask. And it's a quick, like, yes, you're eligible. No, you're not. Move on. Yes, you're suitable. Great. Put that grant opportunity in the one to research further. Next question, what rubric can I use to quickly decide if a grant is worth pursuing for a particular project? So building on that, our previous answer here, it needs to fit your organization type. So whether you're municipal, nonprofit, private, company, corporate, whatever, and it needs to fit your project type. So digitization, conservation, capacity, exhibits programming, what have you. It needs to be the amount that you're looking for. So if you are far enough along where you have a project in mind, you should also have done enough research where you've got a budget in mind. So whatever grant opportunity you're looking at, it needs to be for that amount. And then take into account your timeline and whether, and this part is important, whether it is worth applying to based on return on investment. And I put this little caveat in here because there are some local grants that I have helped clients apply to that are at like the county or regional level. And they were for maybe $3,000 to $5,000, which is a small amount in the grants world. However, the application and then reporting requirements for those grants were so arduous that they were actually worse and more time consuming than getting like a state level grant or a small federal level grant. So that's what I mean by return on investment, where you have to spend 60 hours maybe applying for a $3,000 grant, and that is not a good ROI, versus spending maybe 10 to 20 hours applying for a $50,000 state level grant. That is a much better ROI. So pay attention and try and do the math on that just to save yourself a headache. And then go and check out the faceted search in Lucidea's grant directory. When we put this together, one of the joys of working with Lucidea is they really helped me figure out and put together a way for us to do faceted searching based on, like, I'm looking for this project duration, I'm looking for this award range, I'm looking to do it for this organization type. Those are all search parameters that you can use to filter out the grant opportunities that aren't good for you, and then leave you a list of grant opportunities that are a good fit. So go check that out. Whoop, I think I skipped one. Yes, I did. Okay. What is the best type of grant for my organization type? So I got a series of questions that were very specific. So some of the answers will be similar, but we're going to go through them. What are the best types of grants for small archives within a public library? So I would definitely recommend local municipal grants, especially as you are part of a public library. Sometimes there is federal funding that gets distributed down to the local level that you as an internal candidate can apply for. Another one to look at is IMLS, the Institute of Museum and Library Services, has an accelerating promising practices for new libraries. And I'm not sure why it says new libraries. You don't have to be a new library, but you can also be a somewhat small library, small and or rural, and it can be one or the other. So you can be a small library in a city, you can be a big rural library. You define how you quantify that, but the point being is that they fund both library and archive projects, even though archive isn't in the name. Another one to check out is the National Endowment for Humanities Preservation Assistance Grants for small libraries. And again, archives, because it's sort of in like that gray area for organizations, whether it is a library grant or a museum grant, if you're in an archives, you can usually look at those as well because they are commonly found in those places. And then take a look at CLEAR, the digitizing hidden collections, especially if you are in archives within a larger or a different organization and there isn't a lot of access to your collections currently. That's another great one to look at. Next question, where do I look for grants if I'm in academic archives? So I'm assuming by that you mean you're in like a university or college. And for this one, you can go after many of the national grants, NEH, IMLS. If you're just starting out, I also encourage you to take a look at what your version of your local and regional grants are. And even though you are in academic archives, and perhaps because you are in academic archives, granting agencies will typically view you as needing to get your budget from the university or the college. However, with the current state of things, budgets aren't super great. So it's not uncommon for academic archives to apply for grants. You do have to work a little harder, though, in terms of showing why you need that money. And I recommend bringing in a community tie-in to this to help make it more attractive for granting agencies. And this sort of goes back to a similar answer I gave for the museum who had like 20 million in their budget but still needed to apply for grants. That happens. You just need to be super clear about stating your case and having something that is attractive enough for granting agencies to say yes to. Next question. What are the best fitting grants for a small museum, small staff, no IT support, and large needs? Which you are not alone in that. And I want you to remember the phrase capacity grants. Capacity grants are nice because it can mean like you need to build your staff capacity, you need to build your ability to do projects, so you need more equipment to build your capacity to do those projects. It can be applied in a couple different ways, and it helps you grow whatever your program is. Especially if you needed something that's like a quick cash infusion to help you do bigger and better things, but don't need that cash all the time to do those things. I also recommend if you are on the museum side, there's a great IMLS grant, Inspire. And then checking the Lucidea grants directory. Capacity is one of the faceted search check marks we have, so go check that out. What is the best type of grant for my organization type? Continued. As a state-funded institution, what grants are appropriate to apply for? So the reason, if you're not familiar with state entities, because you're not in one, this is a municipal organization, so government funded, and that means that they're not eligible for grants that require you be a 501c3 nonprofit. Many of the grants that I'm seeing nowadays realize that, especially at the local level, local to state level, that these organizations need help. So with that said, there are a few now that I commonly deal with that actually still exclude any sort of state agency. But I do encourage you to take a look at any sort of internal funding of federal funds that are available at the state level for you. Then, of course, at the federal level, there's grants.gov, whatever your state.gov is, because every state is different. There's usually some sort of local government grant program. What they call it is different, but you should be able to find a granting officer if you're at the state level and contact them. And then SHPO, the acronym we heard of earlier, which is the State Historic Preservation Office. I believe all of those grants, no matter what state you're in, should be available at the state level because, again, it's federal funds being distributed down at the state level. So you've got a couple different places to go look. What's the best type of grant for a specific project type? So we just covered organization type, and then I got about half dozen about some project-specific types. First one, sources for grants to historic sites for public-facing staff, exhibits, programs, and online web/virtual programs. So almost all of these are faceted searches in the Lucidea grants directory. But if you're also looking for like at the local or regional level, using those as part of your Google or what have you search, so like exhibit programming, museum, regional grant, etc., having that in your search. Next question. Are there grants for collection development or space renovation? So yes, this is typically found as capital projects. So there were capacity projects. Now this phrase is capital projects. This is any sort of new construction, renovation construction, conservation-based construction, especially for historic buildings. Those are the type of words you're looking for in your grants. Collection development is going to depend on your organization type, and you're going to want to go with a granting agency that is specific to your organization type. So if your archives, apply to the archive specific ones, museums to museums, etc. And then I do encourage you, these types of projects also tend to be very popular at the state / local level, especially if it is collection based, because your geographic area has its own unique local history, and it is of the most interest at the local level for that type of history to be preserved. So you will have perhaps the most luck or the best competitive edge by applying locally for collection development. Next question. Best grants to support collection rehousing, projects, collection storage, furniture purchases. And so we had touched on a similar question a little earlier, thinking about, I think I used the example of collection storage, but thinking about preservation grants, doing your searches based on preservation, even if it is for things like rehousing and storage, because essentially that is the ultimate outcome, is better storage, better rehousing materials. Those are what will help preserve the collections to stay better for longer. So you can check that out up at the local and national level. And then you can use, if you're using the grants directory, you can use preservation in your faceted search. Okay, continuing, other questions regarding grant options. How do I find digitization grants that don't require the product to be accessible over the internet? And so while that may seem bonkers to some, this is actually something that I have helped a couple clients with just because of the reality of what they were dealing with. They could not put stuff online yet. And so I recommend avoiding national and federal opportunities because at this point, having some sort of online deliverable is becoming an expectation, which if your boss is the reason why you're not online yet, that's something to mention to them because you're going to run into that. And then stick at the local level. So most of the local level grants I have seen are a lot more flexible when it comes to whatever that outcome is, as to whether it is online and or in person. Now, keep in mind, we're currently in COVID times, but for local grants, when it's not a pandemic, if you're having like an open house, a physical exhibit, where your outcome is something that the community can come and enjoy, then that outcome is just as viable as if you were going to put it online. And for even some of the grants in the area that I am in fact, they don't care if anything is online. They actually only care if they can go and see an exhibit, for example. So that's why I recommend sticking with local on that one. Next question. We're looking for getting help with writing our first strategic plan. Any ideas where we could look for funding? So this one, I also recommend sticking to local because the bigger grants will expect you to already have a strategic plan in place. So in your grant application, I also recommend stating that you're going to work with like an outside consultant to help make your strategic plan. Otherwise, people will wonder what you need the money for if it's just the staff coming up with the strategic plan. So keep it local and also make sure you're bringing in outside expertise and that's the reason why you need the money. All right, everyone, we are to the last category. What is your grant project ideas question? So we're going to start focusing on a couple questions about project collaborators. First question, what is the best way to write a project proposal when you'll be working with multiple museums? So there will need to be a primary applicant, not only just for the logistics of trying to gather, collate, and submit the grant, but to also be the point person to work with all the partners to create a cohesive project and narrative. So whether that person will then ultimately be the project manager or not, that is not as important as just making sure you're choosing one person purposefully to do that gathering and organizational work. Uh, Another thing to keep in mind is if you are applying with multiple partners, is that usually the granting agency will only allow one person to be the applicant to do that submission process and also to receive and then disperse that money. So that will probably need to be decided ahead of time by you and your partners who's going to do that additional administrative work. Next question, how do I get buy-in from stakeholders? So whether that is other museums, whether that is other people in your department or outside of your organization, maybe you're working with some community members, the number one thing here is to make sure that you have an authentic and honest relationship based on mutual trust. So the relationship needs to hopefully exist before the idea of the project is there. If not, work needs to be done to establish that relationship and have that in place as you're building the project. And you need to be very clear, no matter what project or stakeholders are there, that the benefits for everybody is clearly articulated and that those are committed and adhered to once you get the money as well. So that way everybody knows what's in it for them, which is a great way to get buy-in because once somebody knows what's in it for them and sees that commitment, it's a lot easier to say yes. Next question, what if I have a project that has not found a home, meaning I have a project idea, but I don't have a repository? So similar to the previous question, build relationships. However, if you're in a position where you don't even have like a person or place in mind, sometimes even just like putting out the like, hey, I have this idea. I'm looking for these types of organizations, or the project output will be this, who's interested, and use your professional association forums. So whether it's SAA, NCPH, AAM, all of the acronyms for our professional orgs, use those forums and email listservs and social networks. Put your idea out there and ask if people are interested in joining, and you'll be surprised. If that idea resonates with them, people will want to sign on, especially if you're the one willing to do most of the work to push it forward. I think you will be able to find several happy candidates that would love to join you. So that's what I recommend for that one. Continuing with collaborators, do you have any advice on collecting information/data from colleagues in other departments? The internal deadlines I set are often ignored. And I feel you. This is a good question. So you are likely already doing these things because it sounds like you are very organized, but just in case, make it as easy as possible. So what other sort of information you need from that person, make sure you clearly identify what that sort of information is. And when you are soliciting help, if you need it from that particular person, are there other people around that person or above that person hierarchically that could like encourage them to do it on time or promptly, or actually get that information for you? Just go around that person that you're not getting it from. Um, and then another thing, and you know, you heard this in the previous answer, if they know what the benefit is for them, like if you could make it about them and make it easy for them, like using both of those tactics hopefully will help you get the information that you need. Otherwise, bribery. I have definitely resorted to bribing people with baked goods. You know, so get creative and strategize a couple different ways where you could get that information with or without them. Next question. What advice do you have for splitting the writing and then implementation of a grant with library staff and friends of the library? So for those that aren't familiar, typically in public library settings, there is a Friends of the Library, which is a separate 501c3 group that can apply for grants as a nonprofit to help fund programs or what have you at the public library. So it's a nice creative way to sort of get around the 501c3 requirement and to help bring more money into these public programs. And so this person, the question is, since you have those two different groups, and one's usually like a board of volunteers versus like staff at the library, how do you work together with that? So similar to the previous collaborator question that we had, designating a point person to be the writer and designating a point person to be the project manager. That may be the same person, it may be two different people. The project manager, however, will most likely be library staff, because if it's work being done at the library, it will most likely have to be done by the staff person. So keep that in mind. And then make roles and expectations clear. So roles of the friends group, they're applying, they're also going to be the manager of the money. They will also likely be the person or entity at least submitting the end of grant report. Being clear about those roles and expectations on both sides will help. And then ultimately, the friends group exists to support the library. That is like the reason they exist. And so making sure that everybody keeps that in mind will also help. However, I will also say the Friends of the Library, they're giving their time and expertise freely to help the public library. So there does need to be some reciprocal gratitude as well. Other questions. So in this category, some other ones that we sort of collated here. How do I incorporate STEM grant projects into my humanities focused organization? So I recommend a couple different things: tying the mission or the strategic plan of the organization to the grant project and why you're sort of incorporating STEM and humanities. Two, work with a STEM subject matter expert as a partner to bring credibility and know-how to the project. So this is if you are on the humanities side, The way you phrased your question made me assume you were the humanities person, but making sure that there are equal representation from both sides to be on the project. And then 3, make it purposeful with meaningful outcomes. So don't just like throw STEM to have STEM in there because it's a current grant trend, but being purposeful about what that outcome will be and why both of those things are being combined. Next question. What projects are most likely to be accepted? Is there a formula to it? So I definitely have a couple blog posts that we'll share at the end that you should check out, but essentially it can get down to this. Competitive projects are the ones with outcomes that best align with the granting agency's mission to fund. They are well constructed with accurate workflows, timelines, and budgets. They benefit multiple audiences, not just themselves. They encourage additional funding, whether cash in hand for match or leveraging funding after the fact. And they purposefully incorporate all appropriate partners, community, internal, external, subject experts, and best practices. So that concludes the marathon of questions, and there are many more that we weren't able to get to today that we are going to get to in a part 2 of this series. But I do want to leave you with a few resources before we go. The first one is the Survivor's Guide to Museum Grant Writing ebook. There's a webinar suite of webinars that I've done with Emmanuel and Lucidea that you can go check out that focus on some grant writing aspects. There's the Lucidea grants directory that I talked about several times that you should definitely go check out because it will help you find grants that are the right fit for you faster than so many of the other databases that I've seen out there. And then the other one is the Lucidea grants workbook and templates. In addition to the ebook that I've published with Lucidea, we have just put out a workbook that leads you through the crafting of a grant project. And it provides you 4 example projects and templates that you can take, plug and play, use and apply on your own. So this was really created to help you get up and running and applying for grants and getting the money that you need so you can get your job and your work funded. So go get those. They are all free. And then here is a list of the grant specific blog posts. I recommend you take a screenshot because there are several of them to go check out. As you can see, there are hurdles to get over. There's bulletproof proposal examples. There's the eligibility suitability checklist. So go check those out. And then I have resources on my website as well. You can check out my services. I have a few grant courses up, one of which is a free mini course called Get Into Grants, a great one if you're new to grant writing. And then I also have my own YouTube channel where I do webinars, when not with Lucidea, webinars that I have done, several of which are grant related. And then just one last plug for the Survivor's Guide to Museum Grant Writing. You can go get the free ebook thanks to Lucidea. It's courtesy of them. And then if you like the physical copy like I do, I believe Lucidea also has it on Amazon. So go check it out. And then, as I said, ask me anything about grants. We are doing a part 2 because I have another whole set of questions that we weren't able to get to today. So mark your calendars, March 3rd, 2021 at 11 a.m. Pacific. We're going to do part 2 of this. And if you have any other questions, when you go register for part 2, pop those in and we'll keep going until we run out of questions.